the, I'd like to go back to the point you made about the United States still had not entirely rejected its isolationist tendencies. General Eisenhower's decision to come back and run for president was motivated in large part by his fear that if Senator Taft became the nominee for the Republican Party, and as expected the Republicans would win the election in 1952, that the Republican Party would basically, it may not have taken the United States out of NATO, but it may not have allowed American troops to be stationed in Europe.
Yep.
I mean, there was a lot of talk about Fortress America, and we'll rely solely on nuclear weapons here, and we won't have these linkages abroad. So we know the history that happened. President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, came back. He got the nomination. He was elected. And he worked very hard to keep the United States not only in NATO, but to strengthen. Now, even General Eisenhower felt that eventually American troops should be able to withdraw.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody could have foreseen how the Cold War was going to play itself out that way. Now, another thing that was happening in those early days, though, was the buildup of theater nuclear forces. And it was in almost every area. Nuclear artillery, short-range nuclear missiles, ADMs, weapons at sea. And you mentioned that you were in the only unit that was not nuclear capable. My recollection is we had to retool all of the fighter production so that every fighter that came off the production line would have this dual capability. And it would be a number of years before we got to the point that we, in the alliance, attempted to extend the nuclear capability to others. It was a complicated story. I think we discussed it a little in an earlier session with the non-proliferation treaty negotiations, the multilateral nuclear force concept. But at any rate, what you eventually got was a NATO that had a conventional component. You never did away entirely with conventional forces. A strong theater, so-called, component, which were these generally shorter range systems, and backed by not only Strategic Air Command, but you had the British nuclear forces, not so much the French nuclear forces until later, and they never had the commitment to NATO like the British did. So you had these three levels, and at the same time that you had those three levels, you had a lot of theorizing going on about how nuclear deterrence would work. You had I'll ask you a question on that in a moment, but just one more point. This was the attractive thing to do if you were an intellectually attuned student in international relations or science or what have you. You had a lot of brain power that was being applied against it. And so would you talk a little about the different levels of warfare and the way that we thought about it and the brain power that was being put against it?
Well, it was pretty schizophrenic, and that you know, in the end, we came to a strategy. And I'll talk a bit about how we got there, but we came to a strategy that, in hindsight, it's quite difficult to understand how we convinced ourselves of this. That is, every NATO exercise that I participated in, from a captain in charge of the Combat Operations Center to four-star general, that there was always the underlying belief that the Red Army would in fact overwhelm conventionally. That the North German plane and the Fulda Gap, we would hold, we would fight, but eventually that they would prevail conventionally. And as that occurred in all of these exercises, then we went nuke. And once we went nuclear, the exercise ended and you could go to the officers club and have a beer. And as I said, this was my experience from captain to four-star general. So that then you have to ask, well, did we really believe that we were going to nuke? By the way, we were working very hard
Mm-hmm.
at the time to change that balance. We weren't happy with it. We weren't satisfied to rely on nuclear weapons. We started pulling out the ADMs quite early. So we were working hard to change that structure. We had things like a salt breaker and new concepts of using tactical air power to mass capability against armored forces. So we worked hard at it. But in the end, we still kind of came back to, we're going to have to use nuclear weapons. Well, the reason I call that a bit schizophrenic is we also were quite certain that that once you crossed that red line, we didn't know how to control escalation. In fact, escalation control was a concept that probably arrived much, much later.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first time I heard anything about escalation control probably was the early 80s. So if other people were talking about it, it didn't come to the level where I was
Mm-hmm.
concerned with strategies. The point is that we had this, call it a strategy, call it a concept, that in order to stop the Red Army invasion of West Germany, that we were going to start World War III. We were going to embark on nuclear World War III with no really believable, credible concept of escalation control. You may, in fact, remember that the Poseidon missiles were dual tasked.
Mm-hmm.
The Poseidon missiles, which were in fact part of the nuclear retaliation force, mostly for defense suppression, but they were also committed to NATO.
Mm-hmm.
So we had already begun to fuzz up the difference between tactical war and strategic war. But the point is, we had convinced ourselves, or at least appeared to have convinced ourselves and our NATO allies, that we would in fact initiate nuclear war to save Western Europe from the invasion. That whether we really believed it or not wasn't particularly important. I think the Soviets believed it, and that was the whole point.
Mm-hmm.
So I had been in several discussions in the early 80s at the right level saying, what do we believe will really happen? What do we believe that the president will really decide? And at the time, all of those discussions were very private.
Mm-hmm.
You could never introduce any doubt that we would retaliate against a nuclear attack against the U.S. or our allies. As far as I'm concerned, we still sustain that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's different now because we don't think now in terms of I push all the buttons and go home. That we do think in terms of even in the worst case, that we will not stop trying to control escalation. Now, whether we succeed or not, but at least it's part of the strategy now. It's part of the concept. We didn't have any of that during at the height of the Cold War. Post-Cold War, of course, we discovered that that the balance was probably far better than we thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
The first time we encountered Soviet-trained elite forces, they turned out to be not as good as we thought they were. Anyway, so they saw the transformation of NATO from clearly warfighting to clearly deterrent, but we went through a very turbulent period when the two were not at all clear. one thing we never lost sight of. That is, we were always working on the mind of the potential adversary. And what we believed wasn't nearly as important as what we believed they believed. Now, whether or not that was valid or not remains to be seen.
Mhm.